The narrow alley was shrouded in shadows, the faint glow of streetlights barely reaching its depths. Old cans and crumpled newspapers rustled as a cold wind whispered through, scattering debris along the damp ground. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Charlie, a scruffy stray dog with matted fur and bright, intelligent eyes, padded cautiously through the passage, his nose twitching as he followed an unfamiliar scent. He was used to navigating the maze of the city, surviving on scraps and the kindness of strangers. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off. Charlie's ears flicked as he picked up a faint noise, a soft, muffled cry that sent a shiver down his spine. He paused, one paw suspended in the air, listening intently. The sound was coming from deeper within the alley, near a stack of old boxes and discarded wooden pallets. The dog's heart thumped in his chest as he moved forward, each step slow and deliberate. The crying grew clearer, a small voice filled with fear and desperation. Charlie let out a cautious bark, not loud enough to draw unwanted attention, but enough to let whoever was hiding know he was there. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint sound of shuffling. Charlie's eyes narrowed as he pushed his nose against one of the boxes, nudging it aside. The box tipped over with a dull thud, and what he saw made his fur stand on end. A small, wide-eyed boy, no older than 7, sat huddled against the cold, brick wall. His cheeks were streaked with tears, and his clothes were torn and dirty. He looked up at Charlie with a mixture of fear and hope. The boy's eyes darted around nervously, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Charlie cocked his head to one side, his tail wagging uncertainly. He took a step closer, and the boy flinched before realizing that the dog meant no harm. "Please, don't bark too loud," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "They'll hear us." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Charlie didn't know who they were, but he could sense the boy's fear. The stray leaned in and nuzzled the boy's small hand, offering the only comfort he could. The sound of footsteps in the distance made Charlie's ears prick up again. They were sharp, hurried, and getting closer. The boy's eyes widened, and he pressed himself tighter against the wall, holding his breath. Charlie's eyes shifted to the mouth of the alley, where the shadows shifted and stretched as two figures appeared, their silhouettes tall and menacing. The figures spoke in low, urgent voices. "We need to find him before anyone else does," one of them said, his voice gravelly and filled with impatience. The other nodded, his eyes scanning the alley with practiced precision. Charlie crouched down, his body tensed and ready to move. He could feel the boy trembling beside him, the air thick with tension. "Keep looking." "He couldn't have gone far," the second figure said, stepping closer. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, gripping Charlie's fur with trembling fingers. The dog held his breath, every muscle in his body taut. The man's footsteps drew nearer, stopping just a few feet from their hiding spot. He kicked a can out of his way, the metallic clang echoing down the alley and sending a shiver through both the boy and the dog. Charlie's eyes met the boy's for a fleeting moment, and he could see the silent plea in them. "Don't make a sound," those eyes seemed to say. The dog's instinct to protect overpowered his fear, and he stood in front of the boy, his small body a barrier between the child and the threat looming nearby. The taller of the two men sighed and looked down the alley. "This is a waste of time. Let's check the other side," he said, turning on his heel. The second man hesitated, squinting into the darkness one last time before following. Their footsteps receded into the distance, and the silence that followed was deafening. The boy let out a shaky breath, tears pooling in his eyes as relief washed over him. He leaned against the wall, exhausted from the sheer terror of the moment. Charlie sat down beside him, eyes still fixed on the mouth of the alley, ears twitching at every distant sound. The boy reached out and buried his small hands in Charlie's fur, holding on as if the dog was his lifeline. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the boy spoke again. "I don't know how I got away," he murmured, eyes unfocused as if replaying a nightmare. "But they're going to keep looking for me. I can't stay here." Charlie's tail wagged slightly, as if to reassure him, though the dog's eyes were still wary. He glanced down the alley, wondering where they could go to escape the danger that seemed to be closing in. The boy looked at Charlie, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I have to find someone who can help," he said, his voice firmer now. "Will you come with me?" Charlie barked softly, the sound barely above a whisper, but it was enough. The boy nodded, wiping his eyes and standing up on shaky legs. He took a step forward, and Charlie stayed close to his side, ready for whatever came next. The two of them moved cautiously toward the back of the alley, where it opened up into a maze of narrow streets. The city felt different now, more menacing, as if every shadow hid a new threat. Charlie's senses were on high alert, his ears flicking at every distant sound, every whispered voice that floated on the wind. Suddenly, a new noise cut through the night, the sound of an approaching vehicle. Its headlights swept across the alley, casting long, stark shadows against the walls. The boy froze, his eyes wide with fear as the black van rolled slowly past. Charlie growled softly, sensing the danger before it fully appeared. The van paused at the entrance of the alley, and the rumble of the engine sent a jolt of adrenaline through both the boy and the dog. "Stay down," the boy whispered, sinking to the ground behind a stack of wooden pallets. Charlie pressed close to him, ears flat and heart pounding. The van idled for a moment, its engine a low growl that seemed to reverberate in their chests. Then, with a screech of tires, it sped off, leaving only silence in its wake. The boy exhaled, the tension in his body slowly releasing. "We need to go," he said, his voice resolute. He stood up, taking Charlie's fur in his hands once more as they stepped out of their hiding place and moved cautiously into the night. The silence was shattered by the sound of hurried footsteps from the other side of the alley. They weren't alone anymore. Charlie's heart raced as he stood protectively in front of the small boy who clung to his fur. The alley felt colder and darker now, the air heavy with the echo of approaching footsteps. The boy's wide eyes, filled with fear, darted from side to side as if he were expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Charlie's ears pricked up, detecting the faint sound of muffled voices not far off. The boy's small, shaky voice trembled as he whispered, "They're coming back, aren't they?" His fingers gripped Charlie's fur tighter, a silent plea for safety. Charlie responded with a low, steady growl, his tail stiff and his body braced. He wasn't going to let anything happen to this boy. The voices outside the alley grew louder, and shadows shifted against the dim light cast by a street lamp. "We need to find him before anyone else does," one of the voices said, cold and authoritative. Charlie's hackles rose. He knew this wasn't just a casual search. The people looking for the boy had a dangerous intent. The boy's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he tried to steady his breathing. "They can't find me," he whispered, almost to himself. Charlie's head turned toward him, sensing the urgency in his voice. The dog's instincts told him that this child needed protection, and he wasn't about to let the approaching strangers hurt him. Charlie's sharp ears caught the faint sound of a car door slamming and the click of footsteps on the pavement. He realized they had only moments before whoever was searching would reach them. The boy pressed himself further into the shadows, barely daring to breathe, while Charlie stood like a guard, eyes focused on the alley entrance. The footsteps slowed as the voices came to a halt just outside the entrance. One of the men spoke up, his voice deep and edged with impatience. "You checked this alley already," he said, annoyed. The other, slightly breathless, replied, "We need to be sure. The kid's too important to slip through our fingers." Charlie's growl deepened as the men moved closer. His stance remained firm, a silent message that whoever tried to come through would have to go through him first. The boy's heart pounded against Charlie's side, the rhythmic thump echoing like a drumbeat. The men exchanged frustrated glances before one of them stepped into the alley, his silhouette casting a long shadow over the pair. For a tense moment, the alley was silent except for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft, distant hum of city life. The man peered into the darkness, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out shapes. Charlie stood as still as stone, watching and waiting. His senses were heightened, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. The man took a hesitant step forward, but a shout from outside the alley drew his attention. "Come on, they're heading toward the other side of the block," the second man called. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The first man hesitated for a moment, scanning the shadows one last time before backing away. "Let's go," he muttered, turning on his heel and disappearing from sight. Charlie let out a quiet, relieved huff and turned to the boy, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "They're gone, for now," the boy said, though his voice still trembled. He wrapped his arms around Charlie's neck, hugging him tightly as if the scruffy dog were a lifeline. Charlie's tense muscles began to relax, but he knew they weren't safe yet. The boy shivered, more from fear than the night air, and Charlie nudged him gently, urging him to move. They had to find a better hiding spot or a safe way out of the area. The boy wiped at his tear-streaked face with the back of his sleeve, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "You saved me, didn't you?" he whispered, meeting Charlie's warm eyes. The dog gave a short bark, as if to say, "Yes, and I'm not done yet." A distant engine roar made them both stiffen. Charlie glanced at the end of the alley where the men had disappeared, and then back at the boy. They had to act fast. The boy seemed to understand, nodding and getting to his feet. He held on to Charlie's scruffy fur, drawing comfort and strength from his presence. With a quiet determination, Charlie led the way, his paws making soft, deliberate steps on the cracked pavement. The boy followed closely, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The two of them navigated through the maze of back alleys, the sound of the city fading into the background as they ventured deeper into quieter, darker paths. The deeper they went, the more the boy's tense posture began to loosen, though his grip on Charlie never wavered. "I don't know where I'm going," the boy admitted in a small voice. Charlie barked softly in response, as if to say, "I'll lead the way." The boy smiled faintly, the first flicker of hope since their frightening chase had begun. They passed old, forgotten buildings, each one more dilapidated than the last. The glow of neon signs from nearby streets barely lit their way, casting eerie reflections in puddles that shimmered under the faint moonlight. Charlie kept his ears perked and his eyes alert, guiding the boy with unwavering confidence. Suddenly, a noise from behind made both of them freeze. The clatter of a trash can being knocked over sent a chill down the boy's spine. He spun around, eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there, just the wind pushing an empty can down the alley. Charlie's low growl quieted as he assessed that they were still alone. The boy let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline coursing through him making it hard to calm down. "We need somewhere to hide, somewhere safe," the boy said, more to himself than to Charlie. He glanced around, eyes searching for a place that would offer more than the temporary cover of shadows. Charlie's nose twitched as he caught an unfamiliar scent, something that didn't belong. He tugged at the boy's sleeve, leading him toward an old wooden fence that bordered a small, overgrown lot. A loose plank creaked as Charlie pushed it aside with his paw, revealing a hidden gap just big enough for them to squeeze through. The boy hesitated for a moment, looking at the narrow opening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. Charlie nudged him again, his brown eyes urging him forward. With a gulp, the boy slipped through, followed closely by the loyal dog. Inside, they found themselves in a forgotten garden, the scent of wildflowers mingling with the damp earth. It was quiet here, a stark contrast to the busy streets and the tension of the chase. The boy sank to the ground, finally allowing himself a moment to rest. Charlie sat beside him, ears still on alert, but eyes softening as he watched the boy's breathing slow. "Thank you, Charlie," the boy whispered, laying a gentle hand on the dog's head. Charlie let out a small huff of contentment, his tail thumping softly on the ground. They had made it through the first part of the night, but both of them knew that this was only the beginning. The mystery of who the boy was running from and why still loomed over them, casting a shadow that promised more challenges to come. Charlie's eyes shifted back to the alley they had come from, the moonlight casting a silvery glow on the path. For now, they were safe. But as the wind rustled the leaves and the distant city sounds hummed, Charlie knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The narrow alley echoed with the heavy, hurried breaths of the boy as he clung to Charlie's shaggy fur. His small frame trembled, and his eyes darted around the dim surroundings, searching for an escape. Charlie, ever alert, paced in front of him, ears twitching at every distant sound. The tense silence was broken by footsteps, sharp and fast, reverberating against the brick walls. They couldn't have gone far, a voice hissed, angry and impatient. Charlie's ears perked up at the familiar sound of danger, and he growled low in his throat. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, pressing himself tightly against the cold, rough wall, hoping it would swallow him whole. The footsteps grew louder, pausing as a shadow crossed the mouth of the alley. A tall figure appeared, outlined against the faint glow of the street lamp. The man squinted, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Check over there," he barked, pointing to a pile of crates and boxes stacked haphazardly a few feet away. Charlie shifted, positioning himself protectively in front of the boy. His muscles tensed, ready to act if needed. The boy opened his eyes just a sliver, enough to see the fearsome loyalty shining in Charlie's dark eyes. He drew a shaky breath and whispered, "Please, stay quiet." One of the pursuers stepped forward and kicked a crate, the crash of wood splintering in the alley making the boy flinch. Charlie didn't move, only continued his silent vigil. The man muttered under his breath and moved to the next stack, his patience wearing thin. The second pursuer, a wiry man with a sharp, calculating gaze, leaned closer to the first. "You're wasting time." "They could be anywhere by now," he said, though his eyes never left the dark corners of the alley. The first man cursed under his breath, frustration etched in every line of his face. He looked back down the alley, the tension in his stance slowly easing as he stepped back. "Let's check the next street. If we don't find them soon, we'll have to call it in," he said, spitting the last words as if admitting defeat burned his tongue. The boy held his breath as the men retreated, their footsteps fading into the distance. When the echo of their voices finally disappeared, he let out a shaky exhale, his whole body shuddering with relief. Charlie turned to face him, tail wagging cautiously as if asking, "Are you okay?" The boy managed a small nod, tears pricking the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching out to touch Charlie's head. Suddenly, the distant rumble of an engine roared to life, shattering the fragile silence. The boy's eyes widened, and he instinctively pulled Charlie closer. The van they had seen earlier rolled down the alley's entrance, its headlights sweeping across the buildings and glinting off the puddles on the cracked pavement. "Hide," the boy mouthed, scrambling to his feet and dragging Charlie with him behind a rusted dumpster. The van slowed, its engine idling as a flashlight beam sliced through the dark. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears, and he could feel Charlie's warm body pressed tightly against his side. A voice from the van called out, harsh and clipped. "Nothing here. Move on." The driver grumbled, and the van jerked forward, its tires kicking up gravel as it turned and drove off into the night. The boy let out a long breath, his body relaxing just slightly. Charlie's ears twitched, scanning for any more sounds of danger. After a few tense moments, the silence returned, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves. The boy sat back, pulling his knees to his chest. His fingers were still tangled in Charlie's fur, holding on as if the dog were a lifeline. "We need to find a safe place," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Charlie seemed to understand, his tail giving a faint wag as he turned to look down the alley, ears swiveling forward. The boy pushed himself up, legs trembling beneath him as he took a tentative step forward. Charlie moved ahead, leading the way with cautious steps and a nose that never stopped sniffing for signs of danger. They navigated through the maze of alleyways, avoiding open spaces and sticking to the shadows. Every noise, every creak or sudden movement made the boy's heart leap into his throat, but Charlie stayed close, his presence a steady source of comfort. As they emerged into a quieter side street, the boy's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The adrenaline that had propelled him this far began to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion. Charlie looked up at him, head cocked, as if sensing his struggle. The boy managed a weak smile. "Just a little further," he said, though he didn't know where further would take them. They needed to find someone, anyone, who could help. But who could they trust? The question gnawed at the edge of his mind, making him feel even smaller and more helpless. Charlie suddenly froze, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The boy tensed, following the dog's gaze to a small, dimly lit building at the end of the street. The sign above the door read Community Center in peeling paint. It looked deserted, but the faint glow from a window suggested otherwise. "Maybe we can hide there," the boy said, hope flickering in his chest. He and Charlie crept closer, the dog's paws making barely a sound against the concrete. The boy hesitated at the door, pressing his ear to the wood. He heard muffled voices, not angry or harsh, but calm and kind. Charlie barked once, softly, as if to say, "It's safe." The boy pushed the door open and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the warm, dim light. A woman with kind eyes and a tired smile looked up from a desk. "Oh my goodness," she said, rising quickly. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Tears filled the boy's eyes as he nodded, his relief making him feel dizzy. Charlie trotted forward, wagging his tail and giving a friendly bark, as if introducing them both. The woman reached out, her gaze shifting between the boy and the loyal dog at his side. "Come on in, both of you. You're safe here." For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy felt the tightness in his chest loosen. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around Charlie, whispering, "We did it." Charlie licked his face, his tail wagging furiously. Just as they settled into the safety of the center, the sound of heavy boots on the sidewalk outside made the boy's eyes widen in fear. Had they really escaped, or was the danger closing in once more? Charlie and the boy burst from the narrow alleyway into the wider street, the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. The black van that had appeared moments earlier was now in pursuit, the engine roaring with intent. The boy, whose name was Tommy, panted hard as he struggled to keep up with Charlie's quick pace. Fear pounded in his chest, but the stray dog's determined glance kept him moving. "Come on, Charlie, we need to hide," Tommy whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder. The van slowed to a crawl, its doors swinging open as two figures emerged. Their voices, sharp and commanding, echoed in the empty street. "Find him now," one barked. The other nodded, their eyes scanning the dimly lit alleyways and corners. Charlie's instincts took over. He tugged at the hem of Tommy's worn shirt, urging him to follow as they darted down another narrow pathway between two old buildings. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, making everything feel more sinister. Tommy's legs wobbled with exhaustion, but he pushed on, trusting that Charlie would lead them somewhere safe. Suddenly, a trash can toppled over, sending a loud crash into the quiet night. Tommy froze, his breath caught in his throat. The men searching for him shouted, and their footsteps quickened. "They heard us," Tommy gasped, fear making his small frame shudder. Charlie stood protectively in front of him, eyes fixed on the direction of the approaching men, his growl low and steady. The men's shadows loomed larger as they approached the alley's entrance. Tommy's heart raced, and tears welled up in his eyes. "Charlie, what do we do?" he whispered, clutching the dog's fur tightly. The dog, sensing the boy's fear, nudged him gently and turned his head towards a small, crumbling gap in the old brick wall nearby. Without hesitation, Tommy squeezed through the opening, the rough edges scraping his arms and legs. Charlie followed, wriggling his body through until they both tumbled into a dark, abandoned courtyard. The space was cluttered with rusted bikes, broken chairs, and weeds that had grown wild. The shadows wrapped around them, concealing them from sight. The men paused at the entrance to the alley, their flashlights slicing through the dark. "They couldn't have gotten far," one muttered, shining his light across the ground. The beam skittered across the overturned trash can and the footprints leading down the narrow path. "Over here," he shouted, taking a step forward. Tommy held his breath, pressing his back against the cold, brick wall. His eyes met Charlie's, and in that moment, he felt a small sense of courage rise within him. The dog's presence was a reminder that he wasn't alone. The footsteps drew closer, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots making Tommy's pulse quicken. The two men stood at the end of the alley, their flashlights scanning left and right. "Split up," one ordered. "We'll cover more ground." Tommy's eyes widened as the light swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. Charlie, sensing the need for silence, crouched low, his eyes locked on the intruders. The men moved down different paths, their voices fading into the distance as they searched. A few tense moments passed, and the silence was deafening. Tommy exhaled shakily, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I think they're gone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Charlie's ears perked up, still listening intently for any sign of danger. Satisfied, he relaxed slightly and licked Tommy's hand, as if to say, "We're okay for now." Tommy looked around the courtyard, trying to gather his thoughts. He knew he couldn't stay there forever. The men would eventually double back, and he needed to find a safer place. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Charlie barked softly, turning his head towards a rusted gate at the far end of the courtyard. Tommy nodded, trusting the dog's instincts. They crept towards the gate, every step cautious and slow. The old metal creaked as Tommy pushed it open, the sound echoing like a warning. He flinched, glancing back over his shoulder, but there was no sign of the men yet. Beyond the gate lay an overgrown path that twisted and turned, disappearing into a cluster of trees. The air grew cooler, and the leaves whispered as a breeze swept through. It felt safer, more hidden, but still, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He quickened his pace, Charlie trotting beside him, ever vigilant. Suddenly, the distant rumble of the van's engine reached their ears. Tommy's heart sank. They were searching nearby, and it wouldn't be long before they realized where he had gone. "We have to hurry," Tommy muttered, urging Charlie forward. The path led them deeper into the trees, where the moonlight barely touched the ground. It was dark and full of shadows, but it was their only chance. They pushed through tangled branches, the underbrush scratching at their legs. Tommy stumbled, catching himself just before he fell. "Almost there, Charlie," he whispered, though he wasn't sure where there was. The sound of voices echoed again, closer this time. "They can't be far." The urgency in the men's tone sent a shiver down Tommy's spine. He fought the urge to cry out, clenching his jaw instead. Charlie barked quietly, nudging Tommy towards a large, hollowed-out tree that loomed just ahead. It was old, its bark split and worn, but it was large enough for them to hide in. Tommy squeezed inside, pulling Charlie with him. They huddled together, their breath mingling in the tight space. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside. "I swear I heard something," one of the men said, shining his flashlight over the path. The light danced just beyond their hiding spot, casting long, eerie shadows. Tommy closed his eyes, holding Charlie tightly. The seconds dragged on like hours, the only sound the pounding of his heart. The men argued in hushed voices, one insisting they keep searching while the other was ready to move on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they turned away, their footsteps retreating into the distance. Tommy exhaled, the relief washing over him like a wave. Charlie nuzzled his arm, licking his face as if to say, "We did it." Tommy laughed softly, tears of relief streaming down his cheeks. "You're amazing, Charlie," he whispered, stroking the dog's fur. But he knew they weren't safe yet. The night was far from over, and they needed a plan. Charlie's ears twitched as he picked up a distant sound, a voice calling Tommy's name, but this time, it was familiar. Hope sparked in Tommy's chest. Could it be someone coming to help? Charlie barked once, a signal that things were changing, that maybe, just maybe, they had found the first step toward safety. Charlie and Tommy burst into the abandoned building, their breathing heavy from the frantic sprint. The place was dark, its broken windows casting shards of moonlight across the dusty floor. Boards creaked under their feet as they moved, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old wood. Tommy's small hands clung tightly to Charlie's fur as they paused just inside the entrance, listening intently for any sound of pursuit. The boy's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and he wiped away the tears that streaked his dirty cheeks. "Please don't let them find us," he whispered, more to himself than to Charlie. The dog's ears twitched, picking up the faintest sounds outside. He stood at attention, a low, almost inaudible growl in his throat. Every instinct in him screamed to protect the boy beside him. Outside, the voices of the men hunting them grew louder. "I know they came this way," one of the men said, his tone harsh and impatient. The crunch of boots on gravel drew nearer, and Tommy's fingers tensed in Charlie's fur, holding on as if the dog were a lifeline. Charlie's heart thudded in his chest, his senses sharp and alert. He looked up at Tommy, who glanced down with eyes wide and brimming with fear. The boy bit his lip, trying to keep silent as his pulse roared in his ears. The seconds felt like hours as they waited, barely daring to breathe. Suddenly, one of the men outside spoke up again, his voice carrying into the building. "Maybe they slipped down the side alley. We need to split up and check." Footsteps shifted, and the shadows of the men stretched across the window before moving away. The noise receded as they spread out, their search widening. Tommy let out a shaky sigh of relief, slumping against the wall. His small body trembled with exhaustion and nerves, but he managed to whisper, "We're safe for now." Charlie barked softly, the sound reassuring and confident. He walked a few cautious steps deeper into the building, his paws silent on the floor. The place was filled with discarded furniture, piles of debris, and old, faded signs that hinted at a time when it was more than just a forgotten shell. The boy's eyes followed Charlie as he moved, and he swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heart. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, the question barely a whisper. Charlie paused, tilting his head as if he understood. His tail gave a brief, reassuring wag, and he moved back to Tommy's side, pressing against him with a warmth that spoke volumes. A sudden noise outside made Tommy's heart leap to his throat. The sound of a car door slamming echoed into the night, followed by a brief silence. He could hear muffled voices, though they were too far away to make out clearly. The boy's eyes darted to the entrance, the tension coiling in his chest once more. The silence stretched on, and then came the creak of an old door in the back of the building. Tommy's eyes widened in fear. He grabbed Charlie's fur tightly, holding his breath as the sound of footsteps grew louder. It wasn't the heavy tread of the men from before, but a slow, careful movement. Whoever it was, they were inside now. Charlie's ears twitched, and he let out a low growl that rumbled deep in his chest. The boy felt his heart pound so hard it hurt, every nerve in his body screaming to run. But there was nowhere to go. The building felt like a trap, its dark corners offering no clear escape. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Tommy's breath caught in his throat. A man with a weathered face and kind eyes stood there, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Tommy," the man said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "It's okay. It's me, Uncle Ben." Relief flooded through Tommy, and he released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Uncle Ben," he cried out, rushing forward to throw himself into the man's arms. The tension in the room eased, and Charlie's growl faded as he sat back, tail wagging slightly. Ben knelt, holding Tommy tightly for a moment before pulling back to look at him. "We need to get you out of here, now," he said, his eyes darting around the dimly lit space. "They're still searching, and we don't have much time." He glanced at Charlie, a hint of amazement crossing his face. "And you, buddy, you've done more than I could have hoped for." Charlie barked, as if to say he was ready for anything. But before they could move, a shout from outside pierced the air. "Over here! I see them!" The men had found their trail. Ben's expression hardened. "Go, out the back. Quickly." He grabbed Tommy's hand, leading him toward a broken door at the far end of the building. Charlie followed, glancing back once to see the shadows of their pursuers looming larger by the second. The three of them pushed through the broken door and emerged into a narrow alley behind the building. The air was cold and biting, but freedom felt closer now. Ben glanced around, spotting an old van parked a few feet away. "Get in," he said, urgency threading through his voice. Tommy scrambled into the van, pulling Charlie in after him. The dog jumped up with surprising agility, positioning himself next to the boy as Ben climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, the van sped down the dark alley, leaving the shouts behind. The city blurred past them as they drove, the tension slowly melting away as the distance between them and their pursuers grew. Tommy leaned against Charlie, his heart finally slowing. "Uncle Ben, where are we going?" he asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. To a safe place, Ben replied, his eyes meeting Tommy's in the rearview mirror. We need to make sure you're both out of harm's way. The van wound through side streets and back alleys until it pulled up to an old, nondescript building on the edge of town. Ben parked and turned to face them. This place is secure. We can rest here for a while. Tommy nodded, feeling a small flicker of safety for the first time in what felt like forever. He looked down at Charlie, who licked his hand, as if to say, I'm here, and we're in this together. Inside, the safe house was modest but warm, with thick curtains that blocked out the world. Ben locked the door behind them and sighed. You're safe now, he said, looking at Tommy with a mixture of relief and determination. But we need to figure out what's next. Charlie settled at Tommy's feet, his eyes bright and alert. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The night had been long, but for the first time, they felt like they were one step ahead of the danger, ready to face whatever came next, side by side. The silence in the abandoned building felt suffocating, broken only by the soft, uneven breaths of the boy as he sat crumpled on the dusty floor. Charlie, the loyal stray dog, stood close by, his fur standing on end as he listened for any sound outside. The boy's small frame shivered, both from the chill and the adrenaline coursing through him. The deep bruise on his arm throbbed, a painful reminder of why he was here. Charlie let out a quiet whine, nudging the boy gently with his nose as if to say, I'm here. You're not alone. The boy's tear-streaked eyes met Charlie's, and for a moment, a faint smile flickered across his face. This scruffy dog had appeared out of nowhere and had given him the first sense of hope he'd felt in days. I have to tell you, the boy whispered, his voice trembling. He hugged his knees to his chest, the weight of fear pressing heavily on him. They took my mom. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, darkening the room with their meaning. Charlie tilted his head, ears pricked, as if he could understand every word. The boy drew a shaky breath and continued, I saw it happen. Men came to our house, shouting. They took her because she found something she wasn't supposed to. Charlie's eyes darted toward the broken window as a gust of wind rattled the glass. The boy flinched, his eyes darting to the doorway, half expecting someone to burst in. But the only movement was the whisper of leaves outside, rustling like a secret being passed from branch to branch. He relaxed slightly, turning back to Charlie. They didn't see me, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was hiding under the stairs. I ran when they left. He reached out, burying his small, cold fingers in Charlie's fur, clinging to the warmth and comfort it provided. The boy's fear was palpable, his body coiled tight as a spring. Charlie responded with a low, reassuring rumble, pressing closer to the boy's side. The room, shadowed and eerie, felt safer with the stray dog's unwavering presence. It was as if Charlie had been put there to protect him, a silent guardian in an unforgiving world. Suddenly, the creak of a distant door broke the moment. The boy's heart raced, and he pulled Charlie closer, holding his breath as footsteps echoed down the hallway. The air felt charged with tension. Charlie's ears flicked back, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside their hiding place. The boy could feel every beat of his heart thundering in his chest, each second stretched long and thin. A voice called out, rough and impatient, "Search this place." He couldn't have gone far. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, praying the shadows would keep them safe. Charlie's muscles tensed, ready to act if needed. The moments ticked by agonizingly slow, each creak of the old floorboards sounding like thunder in the silence. As the footsteps faded, the boy dared to open his eyes. Charlie glanced up at him, his gaze steady and calm. It was as if the dog knew the worst wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. The boy let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. "We can't stay here," he whispered, the words trembling as much as his hands. "We need to find help." He stood slowly, legs shaking, but determination flickered in his eyes. Charlie barked once, a sound that seemed to say, "I'm ready." Together, they edged toward the back door, moving cautiously through the debris-strewn room. The boy reached the door and pushed it open just enough to peer outside. The alley beyond was dark, shadows pooling in every corner, but it was empty. He turned to Charlie, who stepped forward, sniffing the air for any sign of danger. With a nod to himself, the boy slipped through the crack in the door, Charlie close on his heels. The cool night air hit his face, sharp and bracing, but it felt freeing compared to the stale, dusty air of the abandoned building. He looked up at the sky, the stars scattered like tiny beacons. They seemed to promise that there was still hope, even in the darkest moments. As they crept through the narrow passageway, the boy's mind raced. He remembered what his mom had said before they took her: if anything happens, find Uncle Ben. He'll know what to do. A pang of fear twisted his stomach. Would Uncle Ben even know where to start? And what would happen if the men found them before they could reach safety? Charlie nudged him forward, as if sensing the hesitation. The boy swallowed hard and pressed on, his small hand gripping the hem of his jacket. They had to make it, there was no other choice. As they rounded the corner, the sound of an engine revving nearby made them freeze. The headlights of a car swept over the alley, sending their shadows stretching long and thin against the brick walls. The boy pulled Charlie back into the shadows, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. A black car rolled past slowly, its windows tinted dark, and voices inside murmured just out of earshot. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. When the car turned the corner and the rumble of the engine faded, the boy let out a shuddering sigh. Charlie nudged him with his nose, and the boy nodded. "Let's go," he whispered. They moved cautiously down the alley, their path lit only by the glow of distant streetlights. The boy's mind churned, trying to remember the way to Uncle Ben's house. It had been months since their last visit, but he recalled the red door and the garden out front. He hoped Uncle Ben would be there and that he'd believe what he had to say. It was a gamble, but one they had to take. Charlie's ears perked up as a noise echoed nearby, a shout followed by hurried footsteps. The boy's heart leapt into his throat. They were close to the main street now, and there would be people, lights, a chance for safety. But getting there without being seen was a different story. The boy ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets, Charlie by his side, as two men rounded the corner, flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Find him before it's too late," one barked, the urgency in his voice sending a chill down the boy's spine. Charlie pressed against him, warm and solid, a reminder that he wasn't alone. The boy took a deep breath and whispered, "Almost there. Just a little further." The sound of footsteps echoed in the abandoned building, each one causing Tommy's heart to race. He pressed himself against the wall, clutching Charlie's fur for comfort as they listened, breaths held. Charlie stood alert, his tail stiff, his ears perked and focused on the approaching sound. It had only been minutes since they'd managed to elude the men chasing them, but now it seemed like escape had been temporary. A soft call, almost like a whisper, drifted through the broken windows and crumbling walls. "Tommy?" It was the kind of voice he hadn't expected to hear, warm but with urgency. Tommy's wide eyes met Charlie's, his heart pounding as he dared to hope. It sounded like his Uncle Ben. The boy took a deep breath, his chest tightening with emotion. "Uncle Ben," he called back softly, not daring to raise his voice. Charlie let out a gentle bark, sensing the familiar tone. Tommy looked down at his furry friend, a spark of relief beginning to grow. Together, they took cautious steps toward the source of the voice, Charlie leading the way, nose twitching as he sniffed for reassurance. Just as they rounded the corner, they spotted him, Uncle Ben, looking frazzled but determined, his eyes searching every corner of the room. When he saw Tommy, his face broke into a relieved smile. "Tommy," he exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and urgency. He rushed forward, wrapping the boy in a tight hug. "Are you all right?" Tommy nodded, too overwhelmed to speak at first. He clung to his uncle, feeling the weight of the past few hours lift slightly off his shoulders. I didn't know if you'd come," he whispered, his voice catching. Ben pulled back, placing a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Of course I came. I'd never leave you out here alone," he said firmly. His eyes drifted down to Charlie, who stood faithfully by Tommy's side. "And it looks like you had a pretty brave friend looking after you." Ben reached out to scratch Charlie behind the ears, and the dog leaned into the touch, his tail finally wagging after hours of tension. But before they could feel fully safe, a new sound shattered their relief, a shout from outside, one of the voices from earlier. "They must be in there." The words were followed by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the empty streets outside, drawing closer with each second. Ben's face tightened, his eyes darting around as he assessed their options. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They won't stop until they find you, Tommy." He took the boy's hand, pulling him towards the back of the building, where a half-collapsed wall created an opening just big enough for them to slip through. Charlie, ever vigilant, trotted beside them, occasionally glancing back to make sure they weren't being followed. The three of them moved quickly and quietly, hearts racing as they made their way down a narrow alleyway that led to a deserted street. Ben glanced around, his eyes sharp and alert. "My car's just a few blocks away," he whispered, keeping a firm grip on Tommy's hand. Tommy nodded, doing his best to keep up despite his exhaustion. "What about Mom?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They took her. They're trying to keep her from telling people what she found out." Ben's face grew solemn. "I know, Tommy. That's why we have to be smart. She found something big, something they don't want anyone to know about. But I have a copy of what she found," he said, patting the pocket of his jacket. "Once we're safe, we'll make sure the right people see it." Tommy's eyes widened. He hadn't realized just how serious things were. All he knew was that he missed his mom and wanted to see her safe again. He looked down at Charlie, who trotted steadily beside him, a silent but powerful reminder that he wasn't alone. As they approached the car, Ben glanced over his shoulder, his jaw tightening. Two figures had appeared at the far end of the street, and they were moving quickly, their eyes locked onto their targets. Ben's pulse quickened. "Get in the car, Tommy." Quickly, he ordered, opening the back door and ushering the boy inside. Charlie jumped in beside Tommy, settling protectively next to him as Ben slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The car roared to life just as the men broke into a sprint, their shouts filling the air. Ben didn't waste a second. He pressed his foot down on the accelerator, and the car sped down the street, leaving the men scrambling in their wake. Tommy clutched Charlie, his heart racing as he watched the figures grow smaller in the distance. Ben kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in determination. "We're going to a safe place now," he assured Tommy. "Somewhere they won't be able to find us. And once we're there, we'll figure out a way to get your mom back." Tommy nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He glanced at the passing buildings, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since the ordeal had begun. With Charlie by his side and Uncle Ben determined to protect him, he felt stronger than he had in days. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived at a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of town. Ben pulled into the driveway and turned off the car, glancing back at Tommy with a reassuring smile. "This is a safe house. We can rest here, and no one will know where we are," he said, opening the door and stepping out. Tommy and Charlie followed, and as they entered the house, Tommy couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The house was simple but cozy, with warm lights and a comfortable couch that looked more inviting than anything he'd seen in days. Once inside, Ben pulled out the flash drive from his pocket, holding it up for Tommy to see. "This," he said, his voice low and serious, "is what they didn't want your mom to share. She found evidence of something very wrong, something dangerous. And now, we're going to make sure the world knows." Tommy stared at the flash drive, understanding the importance of what his mother had uncovered. "So, we have to get this to the police?" he asked, his eyes wide. Ben nodded. "Yes, but not just any police. We need someone we can trust, someone who won't be swayed by threats or bribes." "I know just the person," he added, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Charlie settled down beside Tommy, his eyes watching Ben as if he understood every word. Tommy leaned down, scratching Charlie's ears, grateful for the loyal dog who had stayed with him through everything. Just then, a knock sounded at the door, making them all freeze. Ben exchanged a tense look with Tommy, holding a finger to his lips as they waited in silence. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Ben took a cautious step toward the door, peering through the peephole. A look of relief crossed his face, and he opened the door to reveal a woman standing there, her face pale but determined. "Mom!" Tommy cried, rushing forward to hug her. His mother knelt down, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "Oh, Tommy, I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to be part of this," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I'm here now, and we're safe." Ben closed the door behind them, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "We've got everything we need to expose them," he said, holding up the flash drive. "Now, it's just a matter of getting it to the right people." Tommy's mother nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're not going to let them get away with this," she said firmly. "Together, we'll make sure the truth comes out." As they sat together, planning their next steps, Tommy felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in days. With his family by his side and Charlie curled up at his feet, he knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The following morning, the news would break, revealing the truth about the corruption and wrongdoing that had threatened their family. The brave actions of a scrappy stray dog, a determined mother, and a courageous boy would leave everyone speechless, proving that even the smallest heroes could make a difference. The shouts behind them grew louder as Ben sped down the narrow street, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. Tommy clung to Charlie, the dog's warm fur a source of comfort amid the chaos. "Are they still following us? And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell." Tommy's voice trembled with fear, and Ben's eyes softened as he looked at his nephew. "Not for long," Ben replied, turning sharply into an alley and shutting off the lights. The car idled in the shadows as they all held their breath. Charlie's ears twitched, and his eyes darted toward the road they had come from. The faint sound of tires screeching and shouts echoing in the distance made the tension palpable. Tommy squeezed Charlie tighter, his small hands trembling. "Shoo, just stay quiet for a moment," Ben whispered. The seconds felt like hours as they waited, hearts pounding in unison. Charlie's tail swished silently, as if to reassure Tommy. The noise outside gradually faded, signaling that their pursuers had gone in a different direction. Ben exhaled, breaking the silence. "We're clear for now," he said, starting the engine again and pulling out carefully. "But we need to move fast." The relief in the car was short-lived as the reality of their situation settled back in. They were safe for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Tommy looked up at his uncle, eyes wide with hope and fear. "Uncle Ben, where are we going?" His voice was small, but there was a glimmer of courage in his gaze. Ben glanced at him, a reassuring smile breaking through his worried expression. "To a safe place. Somewhere they can't find us and where we can get help." He pressed down on the accelerator, guiding the car through the back streets of the city. Charlie's head rested on Tommy's lap, eyes vigilant even as he lay still. After several minutes of weaving through narrow alleys and side streets, they reached an old, brick building hidden behind overgrown trees. It looked like an abandoned factory, but Ben knew it was one of the city's best-kept secrets, a safe house for those who needed protection. He parked the car and turned to Tommy. "We're here. Stay close to me, and don't let go of Charlie." Tommy nodded, clutching the dog as they stepped out of the car. The cool night air stung his skin, but the presence of Charlie by his side made him feel braver. Ben led them to a side door that creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. A tall man with a thick mustache and sharp eyes met them at the entrance. "Ben, you made it," he said, his voice deep and calm. His gaze fell to Tommy and softened. "Is this him?" Ben nodded. The man knelt to Tommy's level, offering a warm smile. "Hi, I'm Sam. You're safe now." Tommy didn't say a word, but he gave a small nod, gripping Charlie's fur as if it were a lifeline. Sam looked at Charlie and chuckled softly. "And this must be your brave friend." Good boy, he said, patting the dog's head. Charlie's tail wagged slightly, a sign of trust. Come on, let's get inside, Sam said, leading them through a maze of hallways until they reached a cozy room with a worn-out sofa and a table strewn with papers. A small lamp cast a warm glow, making the space feel safe. Sit down, and I'll get you some water. Ben sat next to Tommy, who relaxed a bit, feeling safer now. Charlie settled at their feet, eyes still watchful. The minutes passed, and Sam returned with water and a sandwich for Tommy. Eat up, kiddo. You need your strength, Sam said, his voice kind. Tommy took the sandwich, biting into it hungrily. The taste of bread and peanut butter felt like a reminder of simpler times, and it made his eyes well up with tears. Thank you, he whispered, wiping at his eyes. Ben leaned forward, hands clasped together. Sam, we need to find out where they took his mother and get her back. We can't wait any longer. The urgency in his voice made Tommy's heart race again. Charlie nuzzled Tommy's leg, sensing his anxiety. Sam nodded, his expression serious. We've already started tracking them. The men who took her are connected to a group we've been investigating for months. They're dangerous, but now we have leverage. He pointed to the flash drive in Ben's hand. Tommy's eyes widened, and he turned to his uncle. What's on that? He asked, curiosity overcoming his fear for a moment. Ben smiled slightly. Proof that will bring them down. It has documents showing all the illegal things they've been doing. This is what they were trying to hide when they took your mom. Charlie barked softly, as if to say he understood. A knock at the door made everyone freeze. Sam raised a hand, signaling silence, and moved to the door with a careful step. Who is it? He called out, his hand hovering near a concealed weapon at his waist. It's Emily, a voice replied. The tension in the room eased as Sam opened the door to reveal a woman with sharp eyes and a determined expression. We've got eyes on the suspects, she said, glancing at Tommy. They're moving her to a different location, but we know where. Tommy's heart leapt at the news. We have to go get her, he said, standing up so quickly that Charlie barked in surprise. Ben put a calming hand on Tommy's shoulder. We will, but we need to be smart about it, he said. He turned to Sam and Emily. What's the plan? Emily spread a map on the table, pointing to a marked spot. They're taking her to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's heavily guarded, but there's a way in through the back. Tommy looked up at Emily, determination lighting up his face. Can I help? He asked, his voice shaking but full of resolve. Charlie's eyes met his, and the dog let out a soft, encouraging bark. Ben knelt in front of him, meeting his eyes. You've already done more than enough, Tommy. You were brave when it mattered most. Now let us handle this, okay? Tommy nodded slowly, hugging Charlie tightly. Sam clapped his hands together. All right, let's move. The sooner we get there, the better. The room buzzed with energy as they gathered their gear and prepared to leave. As they stepped out into the night, Tommy watched from the window, Charlie by his side. Come back safe, Uncle Ben, he whispered. Charlie licked his hand, a silent promise that everything would be okay. The car engines roared to life, and within moments, they disappeared into the dark, heading toward the warehouse where hope and danger waited. Tommy's heart ached with worry, but he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone, and with Charlie beside him, he knew they would face whatever came next together. The room fell quiet, the distant sounds of the city the only reminder of the outside world. Tommy took a deep breath and looked at Charlie, his fingers entwined in the dog's fur. We did it, Charlie. We found help. Charlie's tail thumped softly against the floor, eyes gleaming with unwavering loyalty. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.